My name is Ahmed Rashid, one of the organizers of the LLF. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much, all of you, for coming. I know for many people the topic in the Hall 1 is also very interesting. So thanks for choosing us. It's a great honor. Let me just introduce our speakers. Ayesha Jalal, the Mary Richardson Professor of History at Tufts University, and the author of many, many books on Pakistan and the founding basis of Pakistan. I don't think here there will be anybody who doesn't know her work. Eugene Rogan, who I'm particularly happy to welcome. He's written he's at Oxford University, the professor at St. Anthony's, and he's written two classic books, one on the Arabs and one on the Ottomans. And I'll be talking to him in a one-to-one session, I think tomorrow. And Afshin Shahi, who's a senior lecturer in Middle East politics and international relations at the University of Bradford in England. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. So I'm going to speak for a few minutes, and then I'm going to ask everyone to just give, how do they see this topic? Just speak for 5 minutes, no more, and then we'll have a discussion amongst ourselves, depending on what you guys have to say, and then I will, open it up to the audience. So the topic is, I think, very relevant to anywhere, to anyone in the world. Are we living in a dismembered world where our sense of respect for democratic values is dying, where we no longer believe in history and the lessons of the past? Europe, that bastion of liberal values and democracy, is now faced with a number of authoritarian regimes, racism and anti-Semitism. In the Muslim world, we seem to move consistently from one dictatorship to another dictatorship, without much of a break in between, even though there has always been the promise of some really genuine change, whether we're talking about the Arab Spring or we're talking about Pakistan or anywhere else. So you're all mostly historians. I would love to hear what you have to say. But historians are also part of this dying profession, where history is not being taken seriously. Is this all the fault of Trump? Are there deeper reasons than that? Let's start with you, Ayesha.
Well, I think I'm more interested in talking about what's fueling populism and the likes of Donald Trump and Narendra Modi and many others. And I do think that populism is a product of a sense of deprivation, those who feel they've been left behind. So all the issues you cite, disenchantment with governance, disenchantment with politics, disenchantment with economic rewards that they feel that they deserve. And in the case of the United States of America, where I live, I can say the middle class is feeling very cramped. The middle class has not seen an increase in its income since really the 90s. I mean, the 70s was a good time, and now they just feel that they are just shrinking. So there is almost a revulsion against what is seen as globalization. There are people writing books on the failure of globalization. And I personally feel that it's the nature of globalization that was basically based on deregulation, neoliberalization, and which led to this degree of disparity and inequality in our world, where people who are not part of the winning with globalization are furious. They are the ones who are putting in people like Donald Trump. They are the ones who will, in Hungary, in Poland, and everywhere in the world, in Brazil. This is where we need to understand that people are feeling the pressure, where they feel that globalization has really assisted the very few, the very rich. It has increased disparities. And so what I'm trying to say is that we need to take this seriously. We shouldn't feel that somehow somebody is cutting us out with this populism, or that we are being, we have to mock this. I think this is a very serious problem in the world, which is only going to grow.
Why this move to the right? If you're disenchanted, why not move to the left?
Well, I think it's useful to remind the audience that there was, populism of the 70s was a very different kind of populism. We saw it in our own country, in this region. There was Indira Gandhi in India. There was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in Pakistan. And there was Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in Bangladesh. And we saw the results of that as well. And I'm happy to talk about the specificity of populism. But the reality is that populism is being fueled by the sense of deprivation in this contemporary turn of our globalization. And I think that's what we need to understand. So having said that, we can certainly expand on this.
Eugene Rogan, you're coming from the land of Brexit, which is about all we hear about on BBC day in and day out. I'm not asking you to explain Brexit to us, but tell us about populism in Britain and what has caused this massive political dysfunction.
Again, I think Ayesha's put her finger on a lot of the drivers of the populist trend. And what's most striking when you view it from the perspective of Britain, mature democracy, two-party system, that the pressures of middle-class discontent has taken the concept of right and left and destroyed them. That the old parties, Labour and Conservative, no longer hold together as parties. And you have a strange appeal from the far right of the Conservative Party on working people in Britain, which would have been inconceivable 30, 40 years ago. The Conservative Party was never the party of the working person in Britain. That was the Labour Party's role. And then to see that the right wing of the Conservative Party would now be able to draw people on a message of populism tells you something about the way in which there's been a reconfiguration in politics that comes right back to a sense of people feeling threatened, the concern that the next generation will have a lower standard of living than the current generation, and a politics of fear. And this leads to xenophobia, extreme nationalism, a prioritizing of the welfare of the nation over all others that I think is not unique to Brexit Britain. I think it's captured in Bolsonaro's appeal in Brazil, Duterte in Philippines. It is a global phenomenon. And all I would say is, as someone who doesn't normally get asked questions about Britain or Brexit, my patch is the Middle East, it is shaping a global political climate that even if we can't speak of populism per se, an autocratic Arab world, it is an environment within which the surrendering of certain human rights standards, international legal standards, has been abandoned because the mood around the world today of populism says the new normal is anything goes. If the regime says it's okay, anything goes. Take it after Trump. If you don't like what the newspapers say, it's fake news. If you don't like your dissidents, you kill them in a very public way. And I think in that, the global populism is being felt even in places that may not have the mechanisms for populism to express itself through elections.
Do you think it was inevitable that the Arab Spring should have been replaced by a spate of authoritarian regimes? I mean, look at President Sisi, who's just announced that he wants to stay in office for another 34 years, which makes him even worse than General Ziaul Haq. I mean,
but his role models,
only 11 years. I think that's very significant.
His role models are Putin and Xi Jinping.
That's right.
We're back to the new normal.
Or Mubarak, I suppose.
Well, obviously in Egypt, but you had a revolution against that notion of autocracy in the Arab world. That was called the Arab Spring. There was an idea that there would be a rewriting of the rules of the social contract between the government and the people. But coming out of that, you had a counter-revolution. And so now I think it's not Mubarak that inspires a constitutional change in Egypt that will allow President Sisi to stay on for decades. It's Xi Jinping. He's rewritten the Chinese constitution to take away the limits on his rule in China, which makes that the new normal. And I think what Putin has done, stopping the game of going between prime minister and president and just going for 4 terms as president, makes it the new normal.
But it's really interesting that liberal democracy, which was the great hope in the 50s and 60s, I mean, if you look at the new research, it shows that even in America there is a severe shrinkage of support for a liberal democracy. So I do think that there is really a crisis in this globally. I'm just to endorse that.
Sure. What are your views of what's been discussed so far?
First of all, I'm not entirely sure, with all due respect, if the so-called Arab Spring was about kind of rewriting the social contract. I think the very term Arab Spring was extremely Eurocentric, and it did not really represent what was really happening on the ground in the Middle East. In my opinion, probably water security and food security were a lot more important in explaining the uprisings in the region, rather than kind of the attempt for kind of challenging this idea of Arab exceptionalism. After all, as we know, the Middle East is known as the least democratic region in the world. Not only this is the least democratic region in the world, but authoritarian regimes. I mean, we have different types of authoritarian regimes in the region. It doesn't matter what type they represent, they are extremely resilient. So for so many decades, academics and policymakers have been discussing why this region is so resilient to the kind of democratic transition and democratic transformation. So I really don't want to get into a discussion about the Arab Spring at this stage. Maybe there is an opportunity to talk about it. I want to talk a little bit about populism. Like the point that you mentioned, I think is very accurate. Popularism is not kind of the cause of the problem, is the symptom of the problem. At least in the way in which it is defined today. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience recognize that popularism as a concept, as a notion, it has gone through a lot of transition over the last 150 years. In the 19th century, popularism was primarily kind of associated to democratic transition and democratic transformation. So it was not a pejorative term. It was not a negative term. As you mentioned, in the 1960s and in the 1970s, popularism started to be primarily associated to utopian leftist organization. Those people who believe that the endpoint of mankind's ideological evolution is a classless society, and they were prepared to do anything to achieve that harmonious utopian society. But the way in which popularism is defined, at least, or it should be defined today, is very different, in my opinion. In the 1960s and in the 1970s, most of the popularist movements, they were kind of looking to the future. They were promising to create a better world. They were promising to create a better social reality. And that social reality that they were promising, that social reality that they were envisaging, it was somewhere in the future. Very much just like the Marxist movement in the 1960s and 70s, and they believe that we need to pass certain historical stages in order to kind of reach that beautiful, harmonious, utopian society. But if you do look at kind of the popularist movements and the populist kind of figures in 21st century, they no longer look into the future. In fact, they are afraid of the future. They are scared by the future. The popularist movements of the 21st century, they look back. Trump wants to make the United States great again. The Brexit was about kind of recreating a British past, which in my opinion, it never existed, but it was about a sense of nostalgia, about a nostalgic Britain. And of course, kind of this kind of anti-establishment dimension is very important, and maybe we can talk about it, and we can talk about different kind of impact of globalization on that referendum. But if you do look at kind of what was prevailing at the time in Britain and in so many other countries across the Western world, which have been kind of affected by populist movements, it seems that now there is a nostalgia about the past. You see it now in Italy, you see it across Germany, you see it in France and so many other countries. And for this reason, I have coined a term.
It's the wrong past. I mean, it's the past of reaction and right-wing regimes, and it's not a past of liberal values. And
Ayesha is correct. I mean, still, very much like the 1960s and the 1970s, popularism is responding to an existing problem. Just in the same way that there were a lot of problems, basically populism is a kind of ideology which creates a dichotomy of us and the elite. We are good, the elite is bad. So we have to challenge the elite in order, or the establishment, in order to make the world a better place. But the ways in which kind of popularism is operating is a little bit different. And that sense of kind of reference to the past, reference to the history, reference to the golden age. Look at basically across the spectrum, from the Middle East to Europe, this idea of British golden age, Islamic golden age, Turkish golden age is really defining the political discourse.
Let me just cut into you there. This whole discussion of history, I mean, people are forgetting their past. People are not using history as an example and as a lesson so that you don't repeat the same mistakes as before. History is kind of being abandoned. It's very difficult to get young people engaged in history. I mean, you wrote this book on the Ottomans. Ayesha has written numerous books on the foundation of Pakistan. And I just wondered, are you finding young people less and less interested in such an esoteric subject as what history has become?
Are you asking
Yeah,
me this?
well,
Well, I absolutely don't agree with you. I think that there is a general problem with knowledge. The instantaneousness of knowledge is resulting in a general dumbing down of the mind overall. If history is affected, but I mean, my own view as a historian is that history's importance cannot be ever simply written off. It is becoming even more important today than ever in our presentist world. And even as we live in this presentist age, we don't realize how much our historical consciousness affects the questions we ask and the answers we seek and sometimes don't get. So what I'm saying is that we are products of history. To say that the history does not matter, and a professional historian and those who study history, I think they are thriving in terms of the ways in which the discipline of history is being taken to new levels. I think men like John Lewis Gaddis, who has written this remarkable book called Landscape of History, it's a pure piece of inspiration.
Okay. Eugene?
Well, I mean, I think from where Ayesha and I sit,
Well, I mean, we're historians, so we're the same, we all agree on this.
absolutely. Well, we're privileged because from Tufts and Oxford, we continue to see amazing students applying to read history, and
They're fabulous.
they're very engaged. They go on to do doctorates to take the field further. So I would say that the jury is mixed on history. As an American, I know that my countrymen use the word history to mean irrelevant. If you say something's history, it means it just doesn't matter anymore. So there is that tendency as well. And then my professional life is in the Middle East, where there's too much respect for history. History is such a dangerous field that archives are kept under lock and key. Historians are very muzzled on what they're allowed to write and say. And indeed, if you approach certain subjects, you could find yourself arrested for it, and it's happening increasingly in the region. Too much respect for history is arguably even worse than insufficient respect for history. At least in America, where Trump is indifferent, we're allowed to go about our business without people arresting us. But the relevance of history, in terms of addressing the problems of the future, you made the point. Ultimately, it's to try and avoid repeating mistakes. But this is an age in which we're facing unprecedented opportunities and unprecedented challenges. And so I think the weight is on the shoulders of leaders today to be providing futurist answers rather than addressing issues of relevance from the past. And in that sense, perhaps history is less relevant in the populist age, even when you talk about the neo-Ottoman agenda or the great Islamic past. I mean, in essence, I think those are things used by regimes, populist regimes, to try and make themselves sound deeply rooted and appealing to voters. But they mean absolutely nothing to the people. The Turkish people do not respond to Erdogan's appeal to Ottomanism by wanting to return to a transnational multi-ethnic empire. Turkey is more nationalist, Turcocentric than ever before. So they don't want to be an Ottoman Empire again with all that implied of Christians and Muslims and Jews and Kurds and Turks and Arabs. And I think it is a tool of populists. History can be used to legitimize them in ways that make us as historians very uncomfortable.
They do use history. That's precisely my point. It's not. The question is that the history is used. It's how it's being used. is
For
the
what
issue.
purpose?
I mean, it's being used in a presentist sense. I mean, history is a dialogue between the present and the past, right? So when you engage with the past and you do it in a particular way, which populist leaders do, so it's not that history is irrelevant. The question is the take on history is what is at issue. It is not the professional historian's take. I think that's the, I mean, so there is the academic scholarship that comes out where the gap is between popular knowledge of history and the scholarship, which is very substantial.
But we need to kind of remind ourselves what history is. I mean, a lot of people automatically assume that history is only about collective memory. But most of the time, more than being about collective memory, it is about collective forgetfulness.
That's right.
The point that you raised about Neo-Ottomanism is fascinating, and it's very important and relevant, because history most of the time is what we make of it, and actually most of the time it tells us more about the prevailing particularities of the time rather than what really happened in the past.
Right.
In fact, in my opinion, vast majority of the Turks do respond to the appeal of Neo-Ottomanism, because to them, Neo-Ottomanism is not going back to kind of transnational Ottoman Empire. For them, Neo-Ottomanism is a kind of reality where Turkey is in the centerpiece of the world, where Turkey is strong, where Turkey defines what really happens in the region. And as we see, he has been unbelievably successful to persuade millions of Turks that there is such thing as Turkish exceptionalism. There is something exceptional about us. Look at our past, look at the history of the Ottoman Empire, look at the golden age of the Turks. Once we ruled the world, and we can rule again. And again, history never ever becomes irrelevant. I mean, of course, it depends what you're exactly talking about. If you're talking about the discipline of history, or generally history as a political tool. And in fact, if you do look at most of the conflicts, certainly in the Middle East, forgive me, I just can't help it because I work on the Middle East, both of us can't help it. If you look at most of the conflicts right now, from Syria to Iraq to Yemen, the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, most of these conflicts are often defined within a historical framework. Look at the kind of language that the so-called Islamic State was using from 2014 until basically now. Using kind of the historical terms, historical vocabulary, historical concepts in order to justify what's happening right now. Look at the ways Iranian regime is kind of rationalizing their monopolization of power 40 years since 1979. They just celebrated their 40th anniversary of the revolution. History is everywhere, but history is selective and is often engineered, is often shaped and reshaped in order to kind of help them to justify and rationalize kind of the prevailing realities.
I mean, Eugene, why I've been so fascinated by your book on the Ottomans is that all of us here grew up on an interpretation of the Muslim world which was based on Arabia and Arabic. Arabic was the language of the Holy Book. You know, the Arabs conquered, came into Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent. And we, in our learning in history as children, we completely bypassed the Ottomans. I mean, we don't take them seriously enough.
Bypass a lot in our history.
Well, I agree there too. And in a way, if you look at, I mean, the Ottomans from outside, they were multi-ethnic. They believed, the role of women, etc. They had a social agenda for their empire. And the fact that they ruled everything from Morocco all the way to Turkey at one stage, I mean, and then tried to conquer Europe even. I mean, they had the largest Muslim empire, far larger than anything out of Baghdad or Damascus or anything else. So what are we seeing? Are we seeing the reliving of that by the present Turkish government?
I think even the way you've set up the question demonstrates why there is no returning to that Ottoman past.
Right.
The kind of global reach that one Muslim power might hope to achieve in world affairs, that the Ottomans could achieve in the 16th century, is not something that can be repeated. So that's one of those lessons of history that is worth studying because it's a part of human culture, but not because it's going to be relevant in human affairs in the future. And any of the, let's say, Islamic revolutionary trends, one thinks about the idea that Iran might export its revolution after 1979, comes to nothing because revolutions are very particular things. They affect people most directly who share the same language and culture as the revolutionary center. Iran was not going to turn the world Islamic green and create a new sort of Tehran-centered Islamic empire. Neither is Erdogan in Turkey. And if you like, the Arab Spring provided a moment where I think Turkey got delusions of grandeur. I remember reading the Egyptian press and the way they lionized the then president Abdullah Gül, the foreign minister, Erdogan, who himself was prime minister at the time. They treated them like rock stars. And they insisted that if Turkey would lend Erdogan to Egypt for 3 months, then Egypt could sort out all of its problems. This created in the Turks' collective political mindset the belief that everywhere an Arab Spring revolution was taking place, a franchise of the Muslim Brotherhood would come to the fore that would be a political ally with the AKP in Turkey, and that Turkey could revive its influence, become the kind of kingmaker of the Middle East. But when the forces of counter-revolution came to the Arab Spring in 2013, that Muslim Brotherhood wave crested, crashed, and withdrew. And Turkey was then left with all of the damage control of trying to keep the conflict in Syria from destabilizing its own frontiers, and then the conflict it launches with the Kurds that spills over between Turkey and Syria. All this to say, if the Middle East wasn't going to be delivered to Turkey on a silver platter, the Turks were in no position to try and extend their influence over it after 2013. And I think now it is very much again focused on a Turkish populist nationalist movement that has no aspirations of going back to those Ottoman grandeur. And one last reflection. Turkey remains very divided between AKP supporters and secularists. It's a rural-urban divide. It's a geographic divide. But for many of those in Ankara or Istanbul or Izmir who are not AKP voters, when they refer to Erdogan as a sultan, it's a pejorative thing. It's to criticize him. When they talk about the Sultan's palace, this enormous mansion that Erdogan has built as a presidential palace in Ankara, it is to criticize him. So history can also be used as a way to condemn that which is retrograde or backwards looking instead of addressing the challenges of the future. And that's what secular Turks mean.
Aisha, what about Pakistan? I mean, we seem to be repeating ourselves again and again and again. Okay, we don't have military rule as such, but we have a very decisive role being played by the military in foreign policy, domestic, everything. Do you see us again moving back into the past and taking up examples of Ayub Khan and Ziaul Haq as being the inspiration for the future, especially within the military? Or,
Well, I coined a word decades ago called democratic authoritarianism. And yes, I think that the future of global democracy is precisely that, because what populism throws up, and we haven't talked about the fallacies of populism adequately, but what it throws up is a walled mentality of us and them, as you pointed out, us and the rich and the elite. But the point is that you have to have a framework to get the delivery. And the popular leader who really, and populism's really characteristic is the cult of personality. And so the strong man has to deliver. Has Trump delivered? Well, I think some of his supporters might think that he has. Many others, especially the white-collar workers who wanted jobs, have not seen jobs. What is happening in the world is that there is a false view that the cause of migration is the cause of all jobs being lost in America. It's the rapists from the South. It's the terrorists from the Muslim world. Nobody talks about how capital moves and automation in America, which has resulted in the loss of jobs to robots. So we need to start, taxing robots. if we are going to get back to, no, this is serious.
Yeah,
So the point that we are facing is an automization of the world, and instead of realizing that it is the automization that is resulting in job losses, the target becomes those us and them mentality begins to play in with the migrant. So if you can't find migrants, you'll find Shia Sunni. So we found that issue here. You know, we created a Muslim country to get away from the Hindus, and then we started fighting with each other. So the point is that this is all about sort of issues of, people feeling part of, the process, and there are lots of people feeling left out. We've seen a gross inequity in the world because neoliberalization got hijacked by neoconservatism and therefore right-wing authoritarianism. Because what you're talking about is, the Bhutto variety or the Indira Gandhi variety was the antidote to modernization theories of the 60s and the disappointment and disenchantment with modernization theory that led to dependency theory arguments and Marxist socialist ideals. That ended, and so now we are facing a scenario where the right wing is holding forth, but are they being able to deliver? That's the question, I think, that we need to talk about. But authoritarianism is very much on the cards. And I think digital democracies are being planned. Look at Aadhaar in India. I think it's going to be very, very interesting what happens there.
Well, I think it's very interesting that socialism is making a comeback in the United States.
Yes.
I mean, you've got
these
new members of Congress.
Is it making a comeback?
These new members of Congress, many of them women, all young, and all self-declared socialists, which is creating a real confrontation in the U.S. Between the right and the left.
Elizabeth Warren.
Maybe I am very pessimistic here, and I'm usually not for those people who know me. I think that is nothing but a cosmetic difference in the political kind of landscape of the United States. We live in a world right now that about 20 individuals have more wealth than 50% of the world population combined. This is the prevailing reality in the 21st century. The conditions that you were kind of reflecting on, inequality, is extremely important. Of course, we can't even begin to talk about the decline of democratic institutions and the rise of populism in the time that we are living in, unless we pay some attention to the failure of capitalism. We may go on and on and on and on talking about the symptoms of the problem, but very rarely we pay any attention to the cause of the problem. The system which was supposed to make us more prosperous, which was supposed to create more harmony, which was supposed to kind of minimize poverty, in fact, has created more division and has created more divide between the haves and the haves not. And this is the situation that we are in. I live in one of the richest countries in the world. The 5th richest country in the world is the United Kingdom. And actually, over the last 4 or 5 years, the food banks have been mushrooming. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who actually work in the United Kingdom, but they cannot afford to feed themselves. If you see a problem like this, this is no longer about kind of the weakening of democratic institutions and the fact that the political parties no longer can respond to the actual popular demand. It is about the weakness of the system, which is inherently creating more inequality and more division. And I think most of the problems that we are seeing from the Middle East to the West, in one way or another, is about finding a kind of response to this prevailing problem. But populism is extremely appealing because populism very often tries to find a simple solution for a very difficult answer. As you mentioned, okay, we have this inequality, a lot of people are out of job, there is a lot of poverty, let's blame the immigrants, just in the same way that we blame the Jews in the 30s. And if you can't blame the Jews and the immigrants, we find somebody else. But in reality, the problem is something else, and the problem is a lot more profound than that, unfortunately.
So yes, more walls, more sort of dictatorship.
Does this mean more violence? Are we really going to see right-wing violence? I mean, this extraordinary case in the US of this customs official who said he wanted to eliminate everyone in the world. And there was somebody else on CNN who said if Trump loses the next election, there will be civil war in the United States, and I will support it.
And they've got the guns.
And they have the guns too.
And they have the guns.
Credible threat.
Is this a situation we could see? Look what's happening in France with the yellow vests, the protest, which has been violent. I mean, quite violent. Are we seeing then a movement towards far greater violence from the deprived, from those who can't, as you said, those who can't feed themselves? Eugene.
I was hesitating because I don't have a quick answer to this question.
You know, but I think violence of the silent sort it has been far more debilitating for the future of democracy. But yes, I think there will be violence, but there will also be pushback as well. There are certain delusions of populists that will simply crumble. I mean, you know, much of, I mean, and I'm not being specific, but if I were to talk about specific populisms, Trump included in this country, included in Modi's, I mean, Modi hasn't been able to deliver on jobs. And as a result, there is a backlash from the rural areas, which will it already played itself out in Madhya Pradesh, is going to play itself much more in this election. So I do think that populists are not devoid of problems. But you know, we may well witness a worse type of populist in the years to come, which could really lead to the kind of violence you envisage.
And then we need to
At the moment we are fighting, the battle is on.
Your point is correct, but at the same time, I think in order to have a better understanding of the situation, we need to broaden our understanding of violence here. And I'm here referring to Zizek, a popularist philosopher who has a very interesting distinction between subjective violence and objective violence. And in fact, we spend most of the time wasting our energy focusing on what majority of people kind of consider as subjective violence. What is subjective violence? For example, terrorism. Over the last 4 or 5 years, terrorism has been on top of the news agenda, certainly in the Western world. But when you do look at the facts and when you do look at the figures, in reality, how many people are affected by terrorism on an annual basis? In fact, even in the height of terrorist activities in Europe, there were more, by comparison, there were more terrorist activities in Europe in 1970s than 2016 in Europe. Despite the fact that statistically, Europe was a lot safer in 2016, but we constantly talked about this subjective violence because it is easy to understand, it is easy to measure. But we don't talk about objective violence. Objective violence is a kind of violence which is creating a lot of pain, which is creating a lot of suffering, and yet it is very difficult to measure it, and it is very difficult to find somebody responsible for it. Last year, just take a guess, what was the cause of the most suffering and most number of deaths on planet Earth? You would think probably wars, conflict, diseases. No. Last year alone, more people died because of suicide than the number of people who were killed as the result of natural disasters and wars and conflicts and civil wars. Last year, 800,000 people committed suicide. So right now, mental health is the #1 biggest security problem that we are facing. Yet nobody talks about it. Environment. Look at the ways in which kind of the shifting ecological kind of situation in the Middle East and beyond, effectively changing everything. You know, I went on and on and on about this over the last 4 or 5 years. Honestly, the war in Syria wasn't about the fact that the Shiites hate Sunnis and the Sunnis hate Shiites. It is about water shortages. At least to a very large degree, there were some ecological factors behind that major social eruption. Look at what's happening in Iraq. Look at what's happening in so many other countries across the world, where ecological realities are changing and shifting the social structures, and yet we don't talk about them. And even when we have an opportunity to talk about violence, we talk about something which is very convenient, terrorism. If we don't actually respond to inequality in the world, we may have more insurgency and we may have more terrorism. But terrorism is not the problem. Terrorism never was the problem, even 4 or 5 years ago, which was on the top of the agenda. What is the problem is mental health. What is the problem is the environmental problems that we are facing. What is the problem is basically the irresponsible food industry, which is causing so much pain and so much death, and yet nobody talks about it. So even if there is an opportunity to talk about violence, we should pay more attention to objective violence.
So, I mean, is populism then a distraction?
Populism is, is like Islamist movements. What was the key message of Ikhwan al-Muslimin, Muslim brothers? Islam huwa al-hal. Islam is the solution. So it's a simple answer to complicated economic and political and social problems. And a lot of people who are living in a desperate situation, they want to hear something like this, a simple solution for a difficult problem. Populism in Europe, very much, I can compare it to Islamist movements across the Middle East. They find one simple problem and they have a very simple solution. If we get rid of the immigrants, if we go back to the past, if we replicate the past, we're going to have a beautiful life. Of course it is distraction. It's not going to change anything, just in the same way that the Islamists, certainly in this country, could not change anything. Zia al-Haq did not make this country a better country, at least in my humble opinion.
On the contrary.
Or the Islamist movement across the Middle East. Look at, I'm originally Iranian. Look at Iran, 40 years after the so-called Islamic Revolution. The situation is a lot worse. It's not even comparable.
Eugene, do you want to add anything before I...
Well, I think that the thing we're ducking is whether it's going to lead to war. I mean, I think we're talking about violence in society in ways that I think are totally directly relevant to the concerns of populism. But when we reflect on the lessons of history, the last time we saw populism as a sweeping force in world politics, it led to the Second World War. And so I think the question a lot of people ask is we can see so much built up of tension between states whose governments behave irresponsibly in the international arena. And are there the tensions present that could be leading us into a conflict situation? And that's when I said I'm pausing to think of how to answer this. I mean, I think this is our biggest concern overall. It's not whether Gilets jaunes are going to bring down Macron. I mean, that's an internal French issue. The question really is, will the increasingly erratic behavior of Trump towards Russia and China, or the way in which cyber conflicts are playing out on, let us say, national infrastructure and information, get to a situation where the targeting of missiles towards each other's capital could lead to the pushing of buttons. We have, the one danger I would say is very unpredictable rulers in this populist age who are not constrained by rules and treaties. The treaties controlling nuclear arms have been abandoned by the Russians and the Americans in a way which has to make all of us very concerned that these irresponsible leaders not take us into a situation which at this point seems so incredible. I can't think of two countries that have serious grounds to go to war. But I mean, the pace of change has been so quick in world affairs that it's hard to predict in 5 years if that will still be the case. So I think giving some real thought to how to de-escalate populism's irrational behavior on institutions and treaties and agreements and keep some rule of order among states so that we don't see populism lead us inevitably towards war would be my concern.
I'm going to open it up. Could we have some lights, please? And the volunteers put some lights on. Have you got microphones? Right. I can't see anything at the moment.
Yeah, better.
So, first question on this side. I saw somebody's hand. No. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yes, hello, thank you all.
Keep the questions as questions and keep them short. Thank you.
Hello, thank you all for your comments, all very insightful and instructive. If the audience would please bear with me, I'd like to preface this with a sort of introduction. I'm a third year undergraduate at Duke University in America, and I'm a Pakistani national. I've lived here for the first 18 years of my life. Sort of stuck in in a weird spot in terms of, the like globalization and like where it's taking us, and like all your comments about like democratic authoritarianism is, I think, the term that you mentioned, and how that's. Well, I came in sort of with a more optimistic viewpoint, and I think it's interesting how you've mentioned history and like how historical consciousness informs the way we think and like how the questions we ask. Well, my understanding, like from looking at history, has been that like historically our conception of equality has always increased. Like, and if we look at the world now, it's much more equal and much more in a lot of ways than it was 100 or so years ago, or many years ago. So, well, my understanding, well, not understanding, but sort of like optimism, sort of led me to believe perhaps would be that maybe in a similar sort of time frame from now, that like geographical inequality, I think, is a term that I would say, like the idea that someone born in the United States is considered has more privilege or like more rights than someone born in, say, Pakistan based on nationality. That would be a similar sort of thing that would be removed based on our understanding of how equality has opened up over the years.
Can we have the question?
Can we have a question?
Yes, ma'am. The question is, do you think that's something that could happen, or do you not think that that's something that's possible?
So you really would like to know whether we think that an optimistic outcome is possible. I think to get there, you will need still policy changes. I think the issue of, despite your suggesting that overall, at what level are you pitching your argument? If you go at that macro level and say, well, global statistics tell us that 600 years ago there was greater inequality than today, and therefore we should be happy, and everything will be fine. But that's not the way, it's a question of perspective. When you bring your perspective to the micro level and you see the intensity of the conflict, when people are fearful about their futures or are actually fearful about feeding their children tomorrow, then I don't think the issue of inequality lessening is going to bother them. What's going to be pertinent is what they're facing. And I think that from an objective point of view, there is in fact evidence that in certain societies there has been a perceptible increase in inequality. And middle classes, certainly in certain countries, are feeling the pinch. And that is what is fueling this particular kind of right-wing authoritarian populism.
Right.
May I just respond?
Sorry.
Yes, please go ahead.
Very quickly, make reference to the idea of geographical lottery. Can you hear me? But I don't think actually this is the case. I don't think this is about the country. I don't think this is about the nation state anymore. This is more about the class and the social class than any other times, perhaps, in human history. Now there are a lot of empirical... Yeah? There are a lot of empirical studies in place which suggest that the idea of American myth, sorry for that.
Can you call the...
This could be a conspiracy.
Can you call the...
I'm from the Middle East, so I have no choice. I look at everything through a conspiratorial lens.
Pakistan too. Pakistan too.
So there is probably somebody against me who doesn't want me to reflect on these issues. There are a lot of studies in place which suggest that the idea of American dream, the idea which could kind of empower people, the idea which could kind of shed light on the importance of meritocracy.
There is a conspiracy.
In the United States. So if you are born in a poor family in the United States, you are extremely likely to die poor within that kind of social structure that you were born in. I don't think it is I don't think it is about kind of the geographical lottery. It is about the class lottery. And I thought, I have to briefly pay attention to that. And the idea of equality, I completely agree with Ayesha. We need to also try to understand equality within a framework in which how equality and the idea of equality is perceived. The fact that, of course, there are a lot of good news today. There are more women in higher education than any other time in human history. This in itself is a fantastic news. And there are so many other advancements and developments. But at the same time, there is something that in social sciences we call relative deprivation. A lot of people who live in the fringe of societies, particularly in the global south, they compare their lives, they compare their opportunities, they compare the situation to the other social classes who have it a lot easier. And that creates a lot of frustration.
Can you improve the sound so we can hear it? Tell the engineers the sound.
Where's the technician?
It's destroying the discussion. Sorry.
That's all right. I stop anyway.
Can we have another question? Right.
After the defeat of Khairuddin Barbarossa,
Can you speak up, sir, please?
after the defeat of Khairuddin Barbarossa, and within 100 years, Turkey was completely contained by the European power, and he was no longer a threat to the longer power. Please explain.
That is your
I think that's for Eugene.
I'm probably the only one on the panel who's written about Khairuddin Barbarossa.
Actually, I'm going to learn. That's very important.
Are you bringing?
I think the answer about naval power all lies in technological innovation. And so the countries that were able to build larger ships capable of carrying more cannon were to dominate the oceans. And that is the difference between the early modern period and the modern navies of the 18th century. And in this way, Europe was able to assert control over the Mediterranean in the course of the 18th century against the actions of Muslim fleets that had made the Ottomans kings of at least the eastern half of the Mediterranean.
But then Turkey was no longer a superpower in Europe.
Well, you say that, but Turkey was to continue to make Europe very nervous until 1680s with the last siege of Vienna. So I think it was too early to write the Ottomans off until sort of the 18th century. Up until that point, the Ottomans remained the great Islamic other that was most feared by the European powers.
Could we have another question? Who has a microphone?
There's a question of...
There are a couple of people here. Just.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my submission is,
Yeah, here, just wait for the microphone.
Can't hear you.
can you hear me?
No,
What's wrong with them?
Rely on your own voice.
there are no technicians here. It's terrible.
What I want to say is, inequality is nature. To substantiate this, I will quote two examples. It is the intellectual disparities between the people which leads to inequality. Intellectualism is the base of all human development, number one. Number two, when you look at the inequality, a mountain of gold is not the same as mountain of iron. Is that not the equality? So what I try to say is that whatsoever system the world has produced so far, the capitalism, the socialism, they have never been in a position to curtail the inequality. And this system of inequality, being nature, will continue forever.
Thank you.
In future, the inequality cannot be reduced because it is a natural phenomenon.
With all due respect,
It's a very personal
You
view.
made your point, thank you.
which was enforced in the 1930s in Europe, and it resulted in catastrophe. This is, in my opinion, social Darwinism. Basically, life is about survival of the fittest. So if there are some needy and weak, let it be, it's none of our business. And actually, there isn't anything natural and there isn't anything organic about this. And actually, even if... And even if we do look at kind of the recent developments in at least certain countries, then perhaps we can actually find something slightly more optimistic and slightly more inspirational. The best example that I can find is Finland. Finland, for those people who are more into European history, may kind of realize that until about 100 years ago, it was a country which could not even feed itself. It was a country which was facing with constant ecological, economic, and political problems. But if you do look at various data which is available, various empirical studies which have been conducted about social structures and social meritocracy in Finland, it is by definition the most equal society in the world, where vast majority of people have access to basic healthcare and basic welfare. So if Finland could achieve that, there is no restriction and there is no problem for the other countries and other continents to follow suit.
Thank you.
Two more questions. There's someone at the back there.
I just wanted to know that in the context of competitive electoral systems, and especially when you mention the challenge of there being the other, like in the case of Brexit, for example, people who have not benefited from UK's prosperity or whatever. Like as a matter of political strategy, how do you counter populism? Like for example in India or Pakistan, if there's a political party strategically is employing populism, then how do you counter it?
Well, I mean, populism, you see, you have to understand that there's not, there are many populisms at any particular time. And if you're witnessing a Modi populist wave in India, it's a product of several issues. It's a product not just of a sense of deprivation or being left out in this liberalization, new liberal phase in India, where people are feeling, especially the rural in the rural countryside, but they're not really going for Mr. Modi necessarily. But I do think that when you say, populism fails eventually. That's what history teaches you. No amount of promising, no amount of delusional politics will actually lead to the fantasy land that populist leaders dream of. What we can sort of see populism as doing for us, in my view, is that we are going to witness a world with more authoritarian regimes, with using digital power. So technology is going to result in a kind of dictatorship that we may not even feel the way we feel. That's why I spoke of silent violence. That violence that I think you spoke very well about, the objective violence, I think that is what's going to be the more serious issues ahead. So I don't think that you need to really combat populism. I think populism is a product of a certain set of issues. It's a product of disenchantment with the governance, with inequality, with fears of migrants, fears of losing jobs, etc., globalization. But having said all that, the answers are not what are being given by populist leaders. So populism will fail eventually, but I do think that other kinds of populisms will emerge. We just happen to be witnessing a particularly right-wing authoritarian type of populism which has come on. It's neoconservatism that basically hijacked neoliberalism.
One point just to remember, that we talk about populism as though it is a 100% phenomenon. And of course, in every country, populism is being challenged by parties that espouse liberal values. And so they're always one election away from losing the control they have. I think looking at Europe, certainly the concern is that there's a rise of populism, which means parties that previously would never have stood a chance of having a seat in a parliament or have a political voice are getting a voice. But it doesn't mean they're dominating yet either. And so I think that the solution does lie in governments beginning to address the underlying issues that are angering voters and making them vote.
But, thank you so much. But the only thing I'm trying to suggest is that I agree that it's being contested, but my fear is that with technology and the move towards a digital dictatorship, the possibility of that is that if we don't sort of correct some of the problems that I think you've spoken about very eloquently, and I've tried to mention a few things about inequality and institutions, that if we don't correct them, then I'm afraid that we are facing a digital dictatorship in the future.
But Ayesha, don't you think it is, again, forgive me, I'm being very pessimistic this afternoon, maybe because I didn't sleep enough last night and I'm still jet lagged, sorry. When you I know we have about 2 or 3 minutes, but very briefly, you also talked about kind of the populist movements in the 1960s and in the 1970s. Those dichotomies of us versus them were created at the time when the people, the agent of change, felt that they can make the state accountable. But actually the state in 2019, in 21st century, is becoming more and more irrelevant. The problems that we are talking about, the problems that we have, are no longer solvable by the nation state. Most of the problems that we are facing, they are transnational. And there are a lot of transnational entities, like multinational organizations, and they are not accountable to our popular demand. And that's why kind of these popularist movements, as you said, of course, they are destined to fail, but at the same time, they are barking at the wrong tree. Again, it's a false flag.
But the only thing I would say to that, Afshin, is it's very important that we as citizens do not accept, it's important that we as citizens do not accept that the populist wave represents us. And when it fails, it tends to fail in war. And so it's important to stand up and say, they don't speak in my name, I will continue to resist. Sure. Their cheap solutions will not deliver on the needs of the people. And so we must continue to push back and fight back, because actually it's not enough that populism fails, we must make it fail.
Yes.
We must replace it with a better solution.
Well done.
Ladies and gentlemen, on that note, unfortunately, our time is up. I hope you imbibed some of the wisdom from this stage, and thank you very much for coming.